The old Latin manuscripts, we've said, are relatively rare, especially in comparison to the later Latin manuscripts that come under the family heading of the Vulgate texts. And of course that's only because of the great popularity that the Vulgate experienced a few centuries after its composition down through history, in combination with the fact that the old Latin manuscripts came such a long time ago. How many were there? Well, Jerome complained that there were almost as many Latin versions as manuscript copies, which meant they really had no time to form family groups because, as Augustine said, in the early days of Christianity, if anyone came into the possession of a Greek manuscript and he assumed that he had any facility whatsoever, be it slight or great, in both languages, Latin and Greek, then he dared to make a translation. So we know that in the early centuries there must have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of what we call the OL, the Old Latin manuscripts. The most important work that's been done really to date, although we'll say more probably in the next teaching in Biblical Lit when we come back to wrapping up some things about the old Latin manuscripts, of some new work that has been done, that is currently being done. Up until that time anyway, the most important work that was ever done was by Sabatier, S-A-B-A-T-I-E-R, the French scholar who spent his whole life in search of the pre-Vulgate Old Latin manuscripts. And his findings were published posthumously in 1743, and it's still today the standard work for the old Latin manuscripts. Not only because it was so exhaustive for its day, but since that time, many of the manuscripts that he had under his fingers don't exist anymore. They've been lost since then. So it's a very, very valuable work. Now, all the authors that you'll check in their enumeration of old Latin manuscripts will generally differ in their numbers. And they'll differ for two reasons. In the first place, some of them are counting Old Testament along with New Testament Old Latin manuscripts, and some are not. I think we're only going to look at maybe two tonight, of Old Latin Old Testament manuscripts, because most of them exist, and the most important ones that exist are for the New Testament writings. And secondly, because some of the scholars count manuscripts on the Old Latin side, even if they have a mixed Old Latin Vulgate text. For instance, some books, maybe like in Hebrews and Revelation, you'll have the Old Latin text, but in every other book of the New Testament you have Vulgate text, because as it's been passed down through the centuries and the copyists have copied them, they've copied from two different textual strains, because two different textual strains occur in their day. So when you sift through all of that and determine whether or not you're going to count Old and New, whether or not you're going to count pure Old Latin texts, and there are very few of those, and those that do exist are for the most part in the Gospels, such as K, E, A, and J, which are all Gospel Old Latin manuscripts. Once you do all of that, then you can come to some understanding that probably is basically a figure that would be agreed upon by anyone who had studied the work. So, we are going after the classification of Bruce Metzger in giving us 157 Old Latin manuscripts. He does count mixed ones, those with Old Latin, those with Vulgate type text. He does not count Old Testament Old Latin manuscripts. So if you keep that in mind, you'll understand why, even though he's an authority and we're going to go by his number of 157, perhaps someone else would say more. Not because they're counting mixed ones. If you don't count mixed, you end up with less. He does count mixed ones, mixed text type of the Old Latin as well as the Vulgate, but because maybe they would count Old Testament Old Latin, Old Testament mixed Old Latin Vulgate manuscripts, whereas Metzger wouldn't. So here's the breakdown that he gives that we're going to begin looking at. For the Gospels, there are 52. And this is a small number, with the 8 to 10 to 15,000 extant Vulgate manuscripts. For the Gospels, 52, more for them, almost twofold more for them than anything else. For the book of Acts, 29 manuscripts. Pauline, 35, but that doesn't mean that each one of those manuscripts contains all of the Pauline epistles. So you've got 13 or 14, however many you want to count, of Paul's epistles. So 35 is really not a large number of that. If one manuscript has 1 Corinthians, and generally they're not that extensive, such as one having all of them, and then another one has 1 Timothy, and another has Philemon, that adds up to 35 in a hurry without really giving us that much text, that much information. Catholic epistles, 26, Book of Revelation, 15. Less for Revelation than anything else. 457 total of the Old Latin manuscripts. Now, the UBS edition of the Greek New Testament and its critical apparatus basically uses 55 of these 157. They use a third. Most of the copies of extant Old Latin manuscripts are only fragments and or palimpsests, in which, of course, we would be given very little information upon which to work. So these 157, just because there are 157, and that sounds like a large number until you compare it. It's large compared to some of the other the language family groups that we've looked at, where there's hardly anything, if anything, extant at all. But then it won't even begin to compare with the Vulgate text, because there's so many thousands of them. But then again, if it seems to be large, really we're not talking about all 157. We're just talking about a third of these, 55. That means the other 100 are basically very, very small fragments that have little to contribute as far as textual criticism is concerned. We're not going to list all 55 of those. They are listed in UBS Greek edition, the New Testament. We will just mention as we go along here some of the more important ones. We'll begin with what's referred to as Codex Vercellensis, or it's Codex A, that is ITA for the Italian, the Old Latin manuscripts. And according to a current work that's being done in Old Latin textual studies, which we'll mention more of next time, it can be referred to in parentheses as number 3. Codex Vercellensis, Vercellensis. Codex Vercellensis. Tradition has it that it was written by Eusebius, the church historian, in the 4th century A.D. Now that tradition has been searched out for its origin, and it's difficult to find. It's been obscured in the ancient pages of history, so we don't know how reliable it is. We do know that it's been followed very greatly by the general public. That is, that Eusebius is the actual copyist, the author of Codex Vercellensis, and because of this great name behind it, great veneration has been accorded to it, to the Codex Vercellensis, to the point that the kisses of the faithful over the centuries have completely erased many, many pages of the text. It's written with gold and silver letters on purple vellum. So it's another one of our beautiful manuscripts. We will have, and we've already had, several of these written with gold and silver letters on purple vellum. Vellum that's been dyed purple, and ink that's been colored gold and silver. So that's written on the vellum, written on the parchment, whatever you want to call it. There really is a technical distinction. One's calf skin, one is sheep skin, but they're generally used synonymously today. And because of the name Eusebius behind it, this great church father and great church historian who supposedly was the scribe of it in the 4th century A.D., then great veneration has been attached to it by the saints over the years. And when I say saints, generally I'm speaking of Roman Catholic saints. And over the years, their kisses, you would kneel before it as it was chained to the altar in front of your church or cathedral. You'd kneel before it and kiss the pages of it. And the kisses of the faithful have completely erased the text on just scores of pages here in the manuscript. Now, why that ever was allowed is beyond comprehension. Of course, sometimes in those days they weren't as careful to guard things as we are today. We look back and find something as precious as this. But what would have had to have taken place was that after the text on a certain page, or maybe 2 pages, was completely erased by the kisses of the faithful, then the local priest or pastor would have just turned the page. And this would have just encouraged it on the next page. And that can happen. It might seem to you impossible, but that can happen with any book. If you've got thousands of touchings or rubbings or kissings, it's going to eventually erase it, and eventually the whole page will disintegrate, of course. It's remarkable that the page is extant so many places, and there's nothing written on it. It's just a blank page. You can see faintly something was there at one time. This has the Gospel, so it's a Gospel Old Latin manuscript in the Western order of Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark. Not the way we have it today, because we followed a different order. And none of the orders are inspired. Ours is certainly not inspired. I don't know, you could argue, and some do argue that, practically no one argues that John is the first gospel. Most argue that his came last chronologically, so I guess that would make sense to have it fourth in the order of the English Bible. But there's great discussion. In Luke, well, that's another question, maybe the next to last one. But there's great discussion over whether Mark or Matthew came first. And there are many people today who believe that Mark's gospel was the first of the 4 gospels written. So if so, why not have it at the beginning of the New Testament to introduce us to the life of Christ? But then again, you could argue, but Matthew serves more as a connection to keep the continuity going between the Old Testament covenant and that in the New. Because remember, Mark starts off no genealogy. He jumps after 13 verses right into the ministry of Christ. Matthew goes back, Jesus Christ. This is the book of the generations of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, Matthew 1:1. So he's connecting us to the Old Testament. And he goes through that 14 generations, which, remember, is an artificial setup there, because he duplicates some and omits others, as we discussed in the end of the creation studies and looking at the genealogies of Genesis and the other portions of Scripture. He's connecting what's going on in the New Testament, the birth of Jesus Christ, down through the centuries, the ages, with what happened in the Old Testament pages. So maybe that should go first. Western order has Matthew first. Our English order has Matthew first, but then the Western order deviates with John and Mark. They leave Luke in the 3rd position, but they swap John and Mark. Tradition says that it's written in the 4th century. That seems to be true, not on the basis of tradition, but on the basis of the handwriting. Whether it was done by Eusebius or not, that would be difficult to prove. Codex Vercellensis, an important Old Latin manuscript. Secondly, we have Codex Colbertinus, Colbertinus, Codex Colbertinus. Not quite as important as Vercellensis. Colbertinus is a 12th century copy of the entire New Testament. Well, now that's not surprising, because it's 12th century. Now, if it's 4th century, that'd be something else. That'd be great to have. We barely have Greek manuscripts that go back 4th century that give us a relatively complete New Testament, like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, as well as much of the Old Testament. But it has the Old Latin only in the Gospels. So here's a mixed text, although it's Gospels. And I've said that of the relatively few pure Old Latin manuscripts, most of them are Gospel manuscripts. Here's an exception. It's Gospel. It's not purely Old Latin. The New Testament has the Old Latin text in the Gospels, and it has the Vulgate from Acts through the book of Revelation. Now, just to make sure you understand what we are talking about when we make a comment like that and saying where Old Latin is found versus where Vulgate is found, both of them are Latin. Old Latin is Latin and Jerome's Vulgate is Latin. So how do you know, as you're reading along, that there's a difference, that you can say now the Gospels are done in Old Latin, and the Vulgate, or the rest of the New Testament's done in Vulgate Latin? How would you know that there's a difference? It's all Latin. It's not written partially in Greek or Hebrew or Gothic. It's all Latin. How would you know there's a difference? Well, because you have certain characteristics that follow Old Latin, such as generally in Old Latin, and this is really the only way you're going to be able to tell, they become accustomed to selecting certain Old Latin words, certain Latin words to translate certain Greek terms. Yet when you get to the Vulgate and its text type, you'll have a different Latin word that's chosen. For instance, you can pick up, to give you a good for instance, why don't we just connect the Gospels from your NIV Bible with the King James Version of the rest of your New Testament, and you read it through. And what do you say? It's all English. It's all English. How could you tell the difference? How could you, centuries from now, go back and say now, it was a different type of English in the Gospels than what you find, just because you're accustomed to how the translators of the King James Version translated certain Greek words. And then you're accustomed to how the translators of the New International Version translated certain Greek words. And there are things that remain relatively consistent, not totally, but relatively consistent throughout the pages of the NIV, and things that remain relatively consistent throughout the pages of the KJV. And so to have that would be to explain what we're talking about, the difference, and how you can know that there's a difference. Now, if you don't read Latin, you really can't tell the difference unless you do a lot of extra time in doing a research of certain Greek terms, and you research them in the Gospels and research them in the rest of the New Testament, and find out how they're translated. Now, does this seem to be a word that regularly is used in the whole, in its entirety, in the Vulgate New Testament or in the Old Latin text? And that is how you determine the difference. Then in the third place, we have Codex Palatinus, Palatinus. Another silver and gold. Many times the first few sentences of each book would be written in gold letters on purple vellum, and the rest of the writing would be done in silver, less costly or expensive than the gold. It is a 5th century copy of the Gospels, Old Latin, that was found in 1730 in the castle of the Bishop of Trent. And Palatinus has become another of the 55 important Old Latin manuscripts. Another one is known as Codex Brixianus, Brixianus, Codex Brixianus. It's a nearly complete copy of the Gospels in silver on purple vellum from the 6th century A.D., 500s A.D. And it is closely related to the famous Gothic manuscript Argentius that we discussed earlier with the Gothic Bible as no doubt the most famous and the most important. We gave you the colorful history behind that of how it was found and then lost, and then it was sent to some scribes to study, and the boat on which it was sent was shipwrecked, but it had been specially packed in crates to keep the salt water off of it in case something like that happened, and finally preserved. And then a thief stole some of the pages of the manuscript, and finally on his deathbed he made a confession of it, and they were restored, and finally just not that many years ago it was displayed publicly for the 400th year anniversary, I believe, of the university where it is housed. It's closely related to that. It's an Old Latin manuscript, but maybe it has affinities to the Gothic translation rather than to a Greek manuscript, to a Greek exemplar, we should say. Number 5, Codex Gigas, or Gig, G-I-Gs, generally how it's abbreviated, G-I-G-A-S. This is probably the most interesting. Codex Gig, or Gigas, probably the most interesting of the Old Latin manuscripts. It formerly was housed at Prague, but in 1648 it was taken as spoils of the 30 Years' War to Stockholm. Same thing happened with Argentius, the Gothic manuscript. It was again part of the spoils of the 30 Years' War. We discussed that earlier. So it formerly was in Czechoslovakia, but in 1648, what today is Czechoslovakia, it was taken as the spoils. The Scandinavians won the 30 Years' War, to Stockholm, Sweden. Now the word means giant, and it's named that because it's one of the largest manuscripts ever discovered in the world. It requires 2 men to lift it off a table. Unless maybe we're talking about a superpower giant from the Soviet Union or something. Maybe one of those guys could lift it. But 2 men, 2 ordinary men, it takes 2 men to lift it, not to carry it, just to lift it off the table. It contains the whole Latin Bible. It's not pure, by the way. Some of it Vulgate, some of it Old Latin. It contains the whole Latin Bible, a Latin translation of Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, a set of 20 encyclopedias, and book after book after book that I didn't take the time to copy down. Various classical writings. Now that's all between 2 covers of 1 book. How they ever got it bound together is probably a miracle. But it's named that because of its huge size. You know what it's like to lift 6 encyclopedias. This is a set of 20 encyclopedias, plus a whole Latin Bible, many other books, and all of Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews translated into Latin. Only the book of Acts and the book of Revelation is Old Latin. The rest of it's Vulgate. The rest of the Latin part of the Bible is Vulgate. Only Acts and Revelation is Old Latin. And it comes from the 13th century. The most unusual, the most interesting of the Old Latin manuscripts. And next in line, the most important of all Old Latin manuscripts is Codex Bobiensis. 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 So this would be to Old Latin what Argentis is to the Gothic Bible. Codex Bobiensis, Bobiensis, is one of the most important of all surviving Old Latin manuscripts. It dates from the 4th century. Okay, that's 300s AD. It's very, very early then. Only 96 pages of it survive. It originally was much longer. Only 96 pages survive. Some of that is Matthew, and it contains almost all of the Gospel of Mark. So it's Bobiensis, you could say, basically is the Gospel of Mark in a very early Old Latin form. One interesting thing about its inclusion of Mark is that it has the so-called short ending of Mark. Remember how there's the no ending in, you could stop with, what is that, verse 7 or 8 in our Bible. Then there's the long ending that we now have in our Bible. Then there's the short ending about preaching the everlasting proclamation of the gospel that Jesus gave to Peter that only goes for a couple of verses. So there's the no ending, the short ending, the long ending. And this manuscript is interesting because of the fact it dates so early, 4th century, 300s AD, and it does contain this unusual short ending from Mark. Now you're familiar with our discussions about Mark chapter 16. The short ending, we've given that to you before. It's in your notes. We've quoted it, read it to you slowly enough. I'm sure it's on a tape somewhere. The short ending about the everlasting proclamation of the eternal golden gospel or whatever just doesn't sound like a verse that's anywhere else in Mark or anywhere else in the Gospels or anywhere else in the New Testament for that matter. The long ending, the problem with that is you do have a lot of words that are unusual Markan terms that are not used by Mark. The style, the vocabulary in the Greek do differ considerably from chapter 1 through chapter 16 and verse 7, 8, or 9, whatever that last verse is, before you get the longer ending, that do differ considerably from that portion of Mark, which is his whole gospel, with what you find in those last so-called charismatic verses, the charismatic section there. So there's a problem with that. Then there's a problem with just having no ending because it just stops on such a negative note. Jesus appeared, Peter and them doubt him, and that's the end. And in John, in the conclusion, well, let's start with Matthew. In the conclusion of Matthew's gospel, there's the commission. It ends on a note that sounds like the ending of a gospel. In Luke, there's a commission. Wait in Jerusalem until you be endued with power from on high. Then the next 2 verses, the last 2 in Luke 24, he goes out as far as Bethany, lifts up his hands, blesses them, he's received into heaven, and they are rejoicing in the temple daily and praising God. John's gospel, it has an interesting ending to it as well. John ends by saying, I could have written more, but the world couldn't contain the books if you're going to write everything that was done, everything that could be said about what was done and spoken in Jesus' ministry. That sounds like an ending. Here's the end. I could write more, but this is a good place to end it. And it ends with a reference to Peter's death and a reference to the longevity of the Apostle John's life, both of which we know in history were fulfilled. So it's kind of predicting, at least for those two apostles, what is going to happen with some of the apostolic band after Jesus' ascension. Gospel of Mark, just ending saying the disciples were doubting the resurrection. Well, then maybe when we end Mark's Gospel, we should doubt the resurrection. Maybe he didn't rise from the dead. We don't even have all the proofs of it that we need whenever he goes on in this so-called longer ending. So it's disputed. And the early manuscripts and the best ones don't give us a long ending. And they don't give us a short ending. They give us no ending. But maybe there was an earlier ending to it that's not the shorter, not the longer, not the no ending, but a fourth alternative that's not been preserved today. For whatever reason, it's not been preserved today. So there's difficulty any way you go about the ending of Mark's Gospel. That's why we said if you're going to believe anything there, it has to be based somewhere else in Scripture. The speaking in tongues, the healing, the working of the miracles, the resurrection, the doubting of the apostles, the rebuke of Jesus to them, the subject of baptism, the subject of going into all the world and preach the gospel. All of those things are found other places. The only problem that some people have would be the drinking of deadly poison. That's not found anywhere else in the New Testament. But it is mentioned in the Old Testament in 2 Kings chapter 4. So even though not the drinking of poison, but the eating of gourds that were poisonous, like eating poisoned mushrooms, it's mentioned over there. So it has scriptural precedent for it. The handling of serpents, of course, that's given many people problems, but Acts 28, Paul did handle a serpent that did bite him. That was a poisonous serpent, a viper, we're told. They didn't do him any harm at all. He shook it off in the fire, and the people changed their mind about him, thought he was a common convict whenever the serpent bit him, but when he didn't die, he must be a god, because they knew the power of the venom of the snake. So anyway you go about Mark 16, you've got problems. It's shaky to base lots of doctrine on the end of Mark chapter 16. And what's true there, and this is a problem that some people have, and they shouldn't. They're worrying, well, if it's not true, then I just can't have it. Well, what's true there, if anything is true, and we believe there are things that are true there, what is true there is going to be supported somewhere else in Scripture anyway. And it's best to have better support than Mark 16. Anyway, my point in getting off on that is that Bobiensis does have the unusual short ending from Mark. Okay, let's look at some Old Testament manuscripts then. First of all, the so-called Constance fragments that were found back in the mid-1800s and ended up being housed in Germany, Constance, Germany, West Germany. It is a manuscript of the prophets. Now, any Old Latin manuscript of the prophets is of great value because they're so few in number. We've got some of the Pentateuch, we have many of the Gospels, Acts, even Revelation. Of the prophets, though, that's a different matter. Very, very few are known. Very few, that is, that come prior to Jerome's Latin prophets that are entirely different than the Old Latin ones. Probably it was written in northern Italy in the 5th century. It ended up in Constance in 1450, where it was dissected. This happened on many occasions. Was taken apart, in other words, and its pages were used as the outside binding for many other manuscripts. Someone thought this was of little value. It certainly was of little value to them, and they took it apart, and you need several good strong pages of something as the outside binding for your parchment manuscript. And so if you don't think this is of very much value, it'd be good to take it apart and preserve what you think is good. So it's been taken apart and used for it's been found in 26 different manuscripts. Pages from what we call them the Constance fragments, because it's not just one manuscript, there are fragments everywhere. They have been used to bind together at least, for the binding of at least 26 different manuscripts, spread all over Germany, that have been found all over Germany. various monasteries, churches, cathedrals, libraries, universities, and so forth. It contains, if you put the fragments together, it contains Hosea, Amos, Micah, Joel, Jonah, Nahum, Ezekiel, and Daniel. If you get parts together, you find parts of at least all of those works. Then let's go on and look at another that's the Constance fragments. Let's go on and look at another Old Testament, Old Latin manuscript that contains some of the Pentateuch. It's referred to as Codex Lugdunensis, Lugdunensis, Lugdunensis. Now, it's an old Latin text that's been discovered since the days of Sabatier, so it's one that was not found in the writings of Sabatier. Came to light in France. Originally, this evidently is where it was housed. Some of its pages were stolen. 79 leaves were stolen in 1847 and then sold to a man interested in old manuscripts. And then this man's son knew of some of the circumstances that this manuscript was missing 79 leaves, and when he reported it to his father, then his father in 1880, this when all of this finally came about, was kind enough to return them so they could be put together with the original manuscript. So there was a separation from 1847 to 1880 of 79 leaves. Since 1895, it's been housed in the library at Lyons, France. And it contains basically Genesis through the end of Judges. Genesis through the end of Judges. The old Latin form. Now, before I go on, let me give you some abbreviations of some of these things that we've already discussed, particularly these New Testament ones. Without going into all 55 of those that could be given, that are some of the important Old Latin manuscripts that contain at least portions of the New Testament, I think we'll just take the time to abbreviate these that we've already looked at, beginning with Versalensis and going through Bobiensis. Versalensis is abbreviated as small it, Italy to speak of Latin, small it with a small superscript a. I'll do one of these up here and you can do the rest. In other words, it would look like that. ITA is the same as Versalensis. It also is referred to in the newer fashion as number 3 in parentheses. Sometimes you'll see the ITA with the number 3 in parentheses, because you go all the way to the end of the English alphabet and we still have need of more letters to refer to more Old Latin manuscripts. And so once you run out of the letters, you have to go to numbers. And so why not just go back to the original letters, like all the way back to A, and start giving us certain numbers. Contains E, the Gospels, the Evangelists. You know how we do this, E. Versalensis, and you'll have the actual name that it goes by, and then it dates 4th century. Just to put this with the 6 manuscripts we just discussed, from Versalensis through Bobiensis. Then number 2, the next one that we discussed, is ITC. ITC, number 6, EAPCR, Evangelist, Acts, Pauline, Catholic, Revelation, the whole New Testament. Colbertinus, you already have the names of all of these, Versalensis, Colbertinus, Paulatinus, Brixianus, Gigas, and Boviensis, and it dates to the 12th century. Then we have ITE, number 2, contains E, the evangelist, some of the Gospels, Paulatinus, 5th century. Number 4, you have ITF, small it, small superscript f. Manuscript number 10 contains the evangelist, Brixianus, Brixianus, dates to the 6th century. Then you have IT gig, IT, then you have 3 letters here. In other words, you've got things like this. You'll have an ITF. That's why we don't go by these anymore, because you just run out of numbers. I think there's an ITF1, there's an ITFF, an ITFF1, things like that. It just gets so confusing. It's best just to call them 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is IT gig. It's number 51. Remember, this is the large one that takes 2 men to lift it. Contains the EAPCR, all of the New Testament. Probably the 13th century. Then we have ITK, number 1. Listed number 1 because it's probably the most important, Boviensis, the most important of all surviving Old Latin manuscripts. Contains E, Gospels. Of course, that's not all the Gospels. A lot of Mark, a little bit of Matthew, none of Luke or John. And it dates to the 4th century. Now, you could go on with 55 numbers, you could go on beyond that. You go to 157 and cover all of them. But those are some of the, either the more interesting or the better known or the most important of the Old Latin manuscripts. Okay, something else to discuss is the fact that there are, within the Old Latin manuscripts, there are different text types. There are different families. Should not be surprising to you. That's found anywhere. It's found in Greek manuscripts. We have it in English. We've got the text of the King James and the text of this version, the text of that version, and so forth. So there are different textual types. There are different text types. They're all still Old Latin, though. There are 3 important ones. First of all, we start with the African text type. Now, the African text of the Old Latin manuscripts is seen in the writings of Cyprian and Tertullian, both of whom come from North Africa. And that's basically why we end up with the name African, not because necessarily, it could be true, but not because necessarily the African Old Latin manuscripts were written in North Africa. Now that's highly possible. Maybe you would even say probable, something like the African text family. But that's not necessarily true. They're named from where the men who make reference to them in their writings come. Wherever they're from, then they have reference to certain names, such as Tertullian. In other words, maybe the African text type of Old Latin manuscripts, maybe the African family was begun in Gaul. Maybe it was begun in Italy. Probably not. Maybe it was begun in Greece. So why don't we call it the Greek family? It's because North African church writers are the ones who use that text. It's seen in their writings, throughout so many of their writings, and therefore the name is derived from the place from which these men have come. Its most important witness is Boviensis. Boviensis is an African text type of Old Latin manuscripts. Boviensis is a free, rough translation. It's not a smooth, literal one. It's very free. It's now housed, by the way, Boviensis at Turin in Italy, northwest Italy, Turin. You've heard of the Shroud of Turin, I'm sure. Also Paulatinus. another one that we've discussed. The third one, the 5th century manuscript. Palatinus is also of the African family. It's housed now at Vienna. Then we have the European. This is just generally known that there are 3 different text types of the Old Latin manuscripts. Then we have the European family of Old Latin, surviving Old Latin manuscripts. They are seen in the writings of Irenaeus and Novatian. So it kind of depends on from where the writer is that these certain names originate. African, European, and the third one. European, seen in Irenaeus and Novatian, it's represented by the codices Vercellensis, first one we looked at, and Veronensis, another one that we didn't look at that I don't even think UBS gives, but another fairly important Old Latin manuscript. Veronensis, Veronensis. And then finally, we have the Italian family. The Italian family. Seen primarily, but not exclusively, in the quotations of Augustine. Now, the only problem with this, and this brings us back to an earlier question that we kind of rambled on about for a few moments, I believe, and that concerns what Augustine had reference to with the Italah. Remember, there are various theories as to what the Italah meant. I think we looked at one theory. It had to do with a certain type of translation, I believe is the way we described it. A certain type of translation that was found in northern Italy. Another view of what Augustine meant by the Italah was that it was just another name for the Vulgate, because he was alive whenever the Vulgate was translated. The Vulgate was translated at the beginning, really, almost the beginning, or part of the way into the ministry of Augustine. Another view of what he meant by the Italah was that he was just referring to Old Latin, to the Old Latin Bible. He talked about different translations, and he said, now the best one is Italah. And so some people have said right away, this is a translation, a special one that was made in North Italy. And that's a generally held view, but by a lot of people, particularly in the past, I think I mentioned that Merle Unger gives that view, seems to lean toward it, but then he mentions the two others after that, two others that we've mentioned right here. Probably according to some of the newer studies that have been done, all that Augustine has reference to down here is Old Latin. He's just talking about the Old Latin Bible. But there are different types of text types in the Old Latin Bible. And one type of text type is what we call the Italian family, the Italian text type of Old Latin. And therefore, maybe that's what he has reference to. Now, the only problem, again, another problem that we have, besides what we just discussed right then, is I've said that these names have deriven themselves from the fact that the author that generally makes reference to them is from that area. Augustine's from North Africa. He's not from Italy. Well, that's just because it still receives the name Italian, because so many other Italian writers do use this type of Old Latin text type in their writings. It just happens that the most famous of all ones who use this is Augustine, and it just so happens that the most famous of all those who do use this is not from Italy, North Italy, South Italy, any portion of Italy, but he's from North Africa. So don't let that confuse you as throwing in a kink to the truth that we just said, that their names are deriven from the fact that the one who does the quoting from them is from this territory. Not that the work had to have been done, had to have been translated, although that's possible, but not that the work had to have been done in these three respective regions, Africa, somewhere in Europe, such as Gaul or Greece or Asia Minor, or Italy, somewhere in North or South Italy.